My cousin has her parents' wedding picture hanging in her house, and I love looking at the picture. My aunt is 20, and my uncle is 25, and she's beautiful, and he's so handsome. They look hopeful, and they look a bit cocky, and I love seeing them in their prime. Two of my aunts are bridesmaids, but my favorite part of the picture is the flower girl, who's my mother. And if I look hard enough, I can see my mother's 82-year-old self peeking through the eyes of that 10-year-old. In the picture, my mother is clearly excited and trying so hard to play it cool. She has a glint in her eye and a half smile on her face as if to say, there's nothing special, this is how I always dress. And I love looking at that picture. I like looking at old pictures even when I don't know the people, and I once stayed at Starved Rock Lodge, and my room was decorated with pictures of when Starved Rock was a logging camp. All of the pictures were of men, but my favorite picture was a group picture of 32 men. I studied each of their faces, the way they sat, their posture, and the way they leaned into each other. And I wondered, since it was taken in 1934, how different their lives must have been. Were any of the older ones in World War I or the younger ones in World War II? It was 1934. And I wondered, is it possible that one of them is still alive? Which one lived the longest? It was 1934, and then I thought, I bet none of these men are circumcised. And then I stopped thinking about the picture and started thinking about uncircumcised penises. It was an uncircumcised penis that saved my sex life, or at the very least changed its trajectory. I used to have a love-hate relationship with blowjobs. I loved giving them, and people hated getting them from me. This probably started when I was in college, and I got my first blowjob from a girl named Jody. I'd fought the idea of intimacy with her. I mean, I knew I was gay, and I didn't want to hurt her, but I wasn't ready to come out of the closet, and somehow offering my penis to her for a blowjob seemed the easiest way to stay in the closet. I was also afraid the blowjob was going to be a total disaster, that I wasn't going to be able to perform or get hard because she was a girl. But it turns out the blowjob was a huge success. The experience was mind-blowing, and it was pleasurable from start to finish, which was way different than my masturbation, which up until that point had been more on the scratchy side. And I should probably explain my scratchy masturbation practices before I go any further. I was a very shy kid with few friends and no one to talk to about sex. When I was young and in elementary and grade school, I would hear the other kids talk about things like hand jobs and playing with themselves, but I was never part of the conversation and I could never figure out what they were talking about. My father never talked to me about sex, but he did have the intention, and so he checked out a book from the library about talking to your children about sex, and he put it on his desk, and I sneaked a peek at the book. And me sneaking a peek at the book might have been his plan all along because he never did talk to me about sex. But because I was sneaking, I hurried, and I might have misunderstood a few things. The book described masturbation, and so now I knew what it was, and it said boys sometimes used a Kleenex or a sheet when masturbating, and so I ran up to my room and rubbed my penis as hard and fast as I could with our generic tissues. It wasn't a great feeling, but I did come, so that was a good feeling, and I went through my youth and well into my college years masturbating like this with a rug burn on my penis. But this blowjob felt so much better. And the feeling was amazing. I mean, it was warm, it was wet, it was amazing, and the visual was great too. I looked down, and she had my penis in her mouth, and she was enjoying herself so much, and I felt really connected. And I also remember thinking, how is she getting the whole thing in her mouth? I mean, I'm not huge in the dick department, but I'm not exactly small, and she was a very small woman. But I stopped thinking about that as my masturbation grunts of discomfort turned into moans of pleasure. I made all kinds of noises while she was completely silent. And what was all over and I was catching my breath, she looked up at me with a glint in her eye and a half smile on her face as if to say, there's nothing special, this is how I always suck dick. It was the same look my mother had in that wedding picture. And then she said, I don't have a gag reflex. And at first I thought she was one of a kind with this no gag reflex thing, but then none of the girls I was with in college had a gag reflex. Both of them took the entire thing in the moaned and gasped. I made all of the noise and neither of them made a sound. Then I moved to Boys Town in Chicago and no one I met there had a gag reflex. And so that's how I thought it was supposed to be. But I developed a very pronounced gag reflex. And when I was 22, I started having a hard time taking a Tylenol. And a dick is way bigger than a dick. So you can imagine my frustration at sucking cock. I kept trying. I'd attempt to take the entire thing in my mouth while not making a sound. I'd open the front of my mouth as wide as I could, and then I guess I'd clench the back and I'd just push. It never worked, and I didn't get a lot of repeats. I was young and I was hot and I did not need repeats. Eventually, I started dating a guy and he did let me repeat until one day he stopped me and he said, you know, Joe, blowjobs just aren't your thing, why don't we just cuddle? Well, that kind of hurt my feelings. And as we cuddled to a rerun of Bewitched, I decided I was going to learn how to give a good blowjob. And so I started asking people for advice. And it turns out, people love giving advice about anything. And one night I was out with a group from work, and I drank too much, and so did everyone else. And all the women and the straight men from the financial company I worked with started giving me advice about blowjobs. Everyone had an opinion. Anyway, the next time I was with my boyfriend, I tried everything that they told me. And when it was over, I smiled, I beamed, and I asked him what he thought. And he told me, and this is an exact quote, it was good because it was from you, and then he patted me on the head. Well, I gave up sucking dick that night. Eventually, he and I broke up, and I decided that I needed to become a dominant top so that I wouldn't have to suck dick and be embarrassed. And I'm lucky because I live in Chicago, and as all gays know, Chicago is a city of bottoms. So our show for being a dominant top is very low. All I did was switch my cigarettes to Marlboro Reds, and I started drinking beer. It worked. And I found a niche, but every once in a while, I would look down and think, oh, I wish I was the one sucking dick. Then one night, I picked up a guy from a bar. He was from Romania.
Is this for real?
But when we got to my place, he told me to suck his dick. And I told him, I thought we went over this at the bar. He said, oh, I want to suck your dick too, but just, I want you to be a little bit first, just a minute, please. Now, I don't generally like the bait and switch, but he was really hot. And I really wanted to do it. And he was going to be leaving the country, so if it was a bad experience, I'd never have to see him again. I told him, you're not going to like it. And he said, let me be the judge of that. So I agreed just for a minute, but when I took it out, it looked different than what I was expecting. He was uncircumcised. I mean, I'd heard of them before, but I had never seen one up close. Now I know today you can't go to a gay bar and throw a rock without hitting one, but in the 1990s, that was not the case. I was a slut. And I had never seen one up close. He noticed I didn't know what to do, and he said, just put the tip in your mouth, and then your tongue between the skin and my dickhead, and somehow, because he was uncircumcised, it felt like there were new rules, and I didn't have to put the whole thing in. So I did just what he told me to do. And he went crazy. And I felt way more powerful than when I was pretending to be a dominant top. I was enjoying myself. He was enjoying himself. And he grabbed the top of my head and started pulling me closer, which was way different than that normal feeling of them holding my head in place as they slowly backed out. I panicked, and I stopped him and I told him, look, I'm sorry, I'm gonna gag. He looked me straight in the eye and said, I want you to choke on it. Now, I've heard that before, but I thought it was just a figure of speech. I mean, I hate slurping and gagging sounds. I can't stand it when I'm eating, I can't stand it when I'm watching TV, and I can't stand it during sex. And I thought everyone was like me. It turns out everyone is not like me. It also turns out that making the sound is way different than just hearing it. And so I made slurping, gagging, and choking noises all night long, and he made noises too. And when it was all over, I looked up at him with a glint in my eye and a half smile on my face to say, there's nothing special, this is how I always do. I know I look a lot like my mother, and I must have looked just like she did in that wedding picture all those years ago. Now I don't always put the whole thing in my mouth. And when I do, I barely have a gag reflex. And even if I don't have to, I always gag at least once. But that's just for fun.
You thought Ernie could come to a show of mine and not hear about penises? That would be crazy. I am on brand all the time.